The space race. After World War II, a new conflict arises, the Cold War. This battle pinned democracy versus communism, or more notably, the United States versus the Soviet Union. The space race happened in the middle of the war from 1957 to 1975.
What causes the space race? By mid-1950s, the United States and the Soviet Union made themselves better by making more nuclear weapons and stronger armies. Now, the tension between the United States and the Soviet Union will go on through the space race. On October 4th, 1957, Soviet R-7 made a mission to launch Sputnik, which is the world's first artificial satellite and the first man-made object to be placed in the Earth's orbit. Now, Sputnik became a surprise, not a pleasant one for the Americans, but they didn't want to back down and they want to be more smarter than the Soviet Union, so they had to make a plan to make a nice creation to defeat Soviet Union.
To combat the Soviets' satellite, the U.S. launches its own satellite in 1958, the Explorer 1, designed by the U.S. Army under direction of rocket scientist Wernher von Braun. In that same year, President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed a public order creating the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, more commonly known as NASA, a federal agency dedicated to space exploration. Eisenhower also created two national security-oriented space programs that would operate simultaneously with NASA's programs. The first one, spearheaded by the U.S. Air Force, dedicated itself to exploring the military potential of space. The second one, led by the Central Intelligence Agency, or the CIA, the Air Force, and a new organization called the National Reconstruction Office that was codenamed Corona. It uses orbital satellites to gather intelligence on Soviet Union and its allies.
Space race heats up. Man and chimps orbits Earth. 1959 Soviet space program took another step forward with the launch of Luna 2, the first space to hit the moon. In April 1961, the Soviet astronaut Yuri Gagarin became the first person to orbit the Earth. He also held a final test flight in March 1961 before the Soviets were able to pull ahead with Gagarin's launch. But also on May 5th, astronaut Alan Shepard became the first American in space, though not in orbit. Later that May, President John F. Kennedy made a bold claim that the United States will land a man on the moon before the end of the decade. In February 1962, the foundation of NASA Lunar Landing Program, Double Project Apollo were in place. Achievements of Apollo. From 1961 to 1964, NASA budget was increased almost 500%. And the lunar landing program eventually involved some 34,000 NASA employees and 375,000 employees of industrial and university constructors. Apollo suffered a setback in January of 1967, where 3 astronauts were killed after their spacecraft caught on fire during a launch of simulation. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union lunar landing program proceeded tensely, but had partial death also in January 1966. December of 1969 saw the launch of Apollo 8, the first manned space mission to orbit the moon from NASA's massive launching facilities on the Merdes Islands. On July 16, 1969, United States astronaut Neil Armstrong, Edwin Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins in the Apollo 11 mission space mission in the first lunar landing attempt. After landing successfully on July 20th, Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon's surface. He's famously called the moment, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind."
So, who won? By landing on the moon, the United States effectively won the space race that began with the Soviets' launch of a satellite in 1957. But both sides made many sacrifices. The Soviet Union had 4 failed attempts to launch a lunar landing, and the United States had many casualties as well. From beginning to end, the American public's attention was captured by the space race and various developments by the Soviet Union and the United States space programs. These were heavily covered in the national media. A frenzy of interest was further encouraged by the new media of television. Astronauts were seen as the ultimate American heroes, and earthbound men and women enjoyed living vicariously through watching them on the television. The Soviets, in turn, were pictured as the ultimate villains, with their massive and relentless efforts to surpass the Americans and prove their power of the communist system. Although with the tension of the space race, in 1975, the joint Apollo-Soyuz mission sent multiple astronauts into space. Their handshake in space served as a symbol of the gradual improvement of the U.S.-Soviet relationship after the late Cold War era.